In the spring of 1241, Europe was certain it was witnessing the beginning of its end. At Legnica in Poland and days later at Mohi in Hungary, Mongol armies had shattered nightly coalitions with terrifying precision. Armored cavalry lay broken across muddy fields, banners trampled into the earth. News spread faster than messengers could ride. Churches rang bells in alarm. Courts whispered of an enemy that did not fight by familiar rules. By winter, Mongol forces stood deep inside Hungary, their patrols probing toward Austria. Nothing in Central Europe appeared capable of stopping them. The road into the heart of the continent seemed open. And then, without a final climactic battle, they turned back. In early 1242, as suddenly as they had come, the Mongols withdrew eastward. Camps were abandoned. Scouts vanished from the frontier. The army that had crushed kingdoms dissolved into the horizon. No decisive European victory forced them out. No grand alliance drove them back. The most unstoppable military machine of the 13th century simply chose to leave. The decision stunned contemporaries and has puzzled historians ever since. Why would an empire at the height of momentum halt its advance? Was it necessity, politics, strategy, or something far more calculated? In that winter retreat lies one of history's most consequential choices. To understand why the Mongol withdrawal shocked the world, it is necessary to understand what the world had come to expect from them. In 1206, on the windswept plains of Mongolia, Temujin was proclaimed Genghis Khan, forging fractured tribes into a single, disciplined force. What emerged was not a loose confederation of raiders, but a military machine built on structure, mobility, and absolute obedience. He reorganized his followers into decimal units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000, deliberately mixing clans to break old loyalties. Promotion was based on merit and reliability rather than noble birth. Discipline was collective. If one man failed, his unit suffered. Orders were carried out without hesitation. This system, combined with the natural horsemanship of steppe warriors, created an army capable of extraordinary speed. Each soldier often rode with multiple mounts, allowing the Mongols to travel vast distances without exhausting their horses. Communication flowed through mounted couriers and battlefield signals, flags, horns, drums, enabling separated units to maneuver as one. What enemies perceived as chaos was, in reality, precise coordination. The results were devastating. Between 1219 and 1221, Genghis Khan crushed the Khwarezmian Empire, reducing major cities such as Bokhara and Samarkand after calculated campaigns that blended siegecraft with terror. In 1223, at the Khalkha River, Mongol generals Subutai and Jebe lured a coalition of Rus princes into a prolonged pursuit before encircling and annihilating them. Under Ogedei Khan, Genghis Khan's successor, expansion accelerated. Northern China was subdued. Central Asia was secured. The empire stretched across continents. The Mongols did not rely on brute strength alone. They mastered psychological warfare. Cities that surrendered were often spared, those that resisted were destroyed with deliberate clarity. Survivors carried stories that weakened the resolve of the next target. The feigned retreat became legendary, turning enemy confidence into fatal error. Reputation traveled ahead of the army, making threats credible before sieges began. By the time Mongol forces entered Eastern Europe in 1241, their dominance seemed inevitable. Kingdom after kingdom had fallen before them. No major campaign had permanently halted their advance. To medieval observers, the Mongols appeared less like an army and more like a force of nature, relentless, adaptive, unstoppable. It was precisely this record of unbroken momentum that made their sudden withdrawal from Europe so astonishing. By 1241, Europe stood exposed before a power it scarcely understood. The Mongol advance into the continent was not a chaotic raid but a coordinated campaign led by Bata Khan and the veteran general Subutai. Their forces moved with calculated speed through Poland and Hungary, dividing enemy attention and preventing unified resistance. On April 9, 1241, near the town of Legnica in Poland, a coalition of Silesian knights, German contingents, and troops of the Teutonic Order confronted a Mongol detachment. The Europeans relied on the shock power of heavy cavalry, charging with confidence born from centuries of battlefield tradition. The Mongols answered with mobility and deception. Feigned withdrawals drew the knights out of formation. Arrows struck commanders first, breaking cohesion. Within hours, the coalition collapsed, its leaders killed and its army scattered. 2 days later, on April 11, the main Mongol force engaged the Hungarian army at the Battle of Mohi along the Sejo River. King Bela IV had assembled a large host and fortified his camp, believing the river would limit Mongol maneuverability. Yet the Mongols adapted. While one division attacked the main bridge to fix Hungarian attention, another constructed a crossing downstream under cover of darkness. At dawn, Hungarian forces faced attacks from multiple directions. Feigned retreats once again stretched formations thin. Encirclement followed. Panic replaced coordination. The Hungarian army was shattered, and the kingdom left defenseless. The psychological shock was immediate. Reports of annihilated armies spread westward. Chroniclers described terror gripping courts and monasteries. Vienna prepared for siege. Rumors reached Rome. The pattern was familiar: swift engagement, confusion, collapse. No European coalition had yet devised an effective counter. The Mongols seemed to dismantle not only armies but assumptions about warfare itself. By late 1241, Mongol forces roamed deep within Hungary. Reconnaissance units probed toward Austria. Winter camps were established. Nothing resembling a unified European defense had materialized. The road into the heart of the Holy Roman Empire appeared open. To contemporaries, it seemed only a matter of time before Central Europe faced the same fate as Central Asia. The momentum was unmistakable. Victory appeared not merely possible, but imminent. And then, at the height of advantage, the advance stopped. In December 1241, far from the frozen plains of Hungary, a death occurred that would ripple across continents. Ogedei Khan, son of Genghis Khan and Great Khan of the Mongol Empire, died in Karakorum. His reign had overseen the consolidation and expansion of Mongol power from China to Eastern Europe. Under his authority, campaigns were coordinated across vast distances, and the western invasion that brought Bada Khan and Subutai to the gates of Central Europe had unfolded. With his death, the empire faced a moment of transition, and potential instability. Mongol political tradition required that princes of the royal bloodline attend a Kurultai, a grand assembly convened to elect the next great Khan. In theory, this meant that senior commanders campaigning far from the imperial center were expected to return to participate in the succession. The legitimacy of the empire rested on consensus among the ruling elite. Absence could weaken a claimant's influence, or worse, allow rivals to consolidate power in his stead. News of Ogedei's death traveled slowly westward, carried by mounted messengers across thousands of miles. When word reached Bada Khan's forces in early 1242, they were still positioned deep within Hungarian territory. The Mongol army had not been defeated. It had not exhausted its capacity for advance. Yet the political ground beneath it had shifted. Batu, as a grandson of Genghis Khan and leader of the Western campaign, now faced a decision that extended beyond the battlefield. Some historians argue that Mongol law effectively compelled withdrawal. Others suggest that the requirement was less rigid than later tradition implied. The empire had conducted campaigns before while succession disputes simmered. What is clear is that the death of the Great Khan introduced uncertainty at the highest level of authority. Continuing westward risked diminishing Batu's role in shaping the future of the empire. Remaining absent during the selection of a new Great Khan could leave him vulnerable to rivals. Thus, the withdrawal from Europe may not have been a retreat in the face of resistance, but a pivot toward imperial politics. The army that had crushed European coalitions now began moving east, not because it had been stopped, but because the center of gravity had shifted. A decision made in distant Karakorum altered the fate of a continent poised on the brink. The death of Ogidi did not merely create a vacancy on the throne, it exposed the fragile balance within the Mongol ruling family. The empire that had appeared so unified in conquest was, beneath the surface, divided by rivalries. Batu Khan, leader of the Western campaign and grandson of Genghis Khan through Jochi, commanded immense military prestige after the victories in Eastern Europe. Yet succession politics did not revolve around battlefield success alone. Power within the empire was distributed among competing branches of the royal lineage, each with its own ambitions. One of Batu's principal rivals was Gyuk, Ogidi's son. Tensions between the two had already surfaced during earlier campaigns. Disputes over command authority and personal slights had hardened into mistrust. If Batu remained in Hungary, far from the imperial heartland, he risked allowing Gyuk and his allies to dominate the Kurultai. The election of a new great Khan would shape appointments, future campaigns, and the balance of influence across the empire. Absence could mean marginalization. In this context, the withdrawal from Europe takes on a different dimension. It was not simply obedience to tradition, it may have been a strategic calculation. The Mongols understood power not only in terms of territory, but legitimacy. A general who conquered lands yet lost influence at the center could find his authority undermined. Batu's decision to pull back preserved his position within imperial politics. Rather than gamble Europe for uncertain gains, he secured his power base on the Volga and in the western steppes. The irony is striking. The army that had terrified Europe into fragmentation was itself constrained by internal dynamics. The same structure that made Mongol campaigns disciplined and coordinated also required consensus at the top. Succession was not automatic, it demanded negotiation among princes. The empire's strength lay in unity, and unity required participation. Thus, one Mongol decision may have been less about sparing Europe and more about preserving leverage within a global empire. Conquest could resume. Territory could be reclaimed. But political influence, once lost, was harder to restore. In choosing to prioritize the succession struggle over continued advance, Batu altered the trajectory of Western history. Europe survived not because it defeated the Mongols, but because Mongol politics proved more urgent than Mongol expansion. While politics provides a powerful explanation for the Mongol withdrawal, it was not the only factor shaping the decision. The realities of geography and logistics in Central Europe presented challenges different from those faced on the open steppe. The Mongol military system depended heavily on mobility, vast grazing lands, and the ability to sustain large numbers of horses. Each warrior often required multiple mounts, and the success of their campaigns relied on maintaining speed and flexibility. Hungary's plains initially suited this approach, but conditions began to shift during the winter of 1241 to 1242. Contemporary accounts and later climate studies suggest that the winter was harsh and unpredictable. Rivers froze and then flooded with sudden thaws. Marshy terrain complicated movement. Supply lines stretched further from established bases in the east. Although the Mongols were adept at living off the land, sustained operations deeper into Western Europe would have required adapting to denser forests, fortified towns, and landscapes less conducive to large-scale cavalry maneuvers. The open steppe that had enabled rapid encirclement tactics gave way to regions where heavy stone castles dominated key routes. Western Europe also differed politically from the fragmented principalities of Eastern Europe and Central Asia. While divided, its power centers were compact and heavily fortified. Conquering them would have demanded prolonged sieges rather than swift field engagements. Mongol siegecraft was formidable, as later demonstrated in the Middle East. But extended campaigns against numerous fortified cities would have slowed the momentum that defined their earlier successes. This does not mean Europe was on the verge of defeating the Mongols outright. The victories at Legnica and Mohi proved that European armies were vulnerable to Mongol tactics. Yet the cost of pushing further west may have risen. Expansion required weighing reward against risk. With uncertainty looming over imperial succession and environmental conditions complicating operations, the calculus shifted. The Mongols were not reckless conquerors driven solely by momentum. They were pragmatic strategists. Withdrawal did not signify weakness but adaptation. They had demonstrated their ability to penetrate Europe and shatter its armies. Continuing might have been possible, but it was no longer strategically optimal. The decision to turn east may have reflected a broader assessment: the empire's stability and long-term advantage outweighed the immediate temptation of further conquest. When the Mongols withdrew in 1242, the reaction across Europe was a mixture of disbelief and relief. Kingdoms that had braced for annihilation found themselves granted an unexpected reprieve. Churches that had rung alarm bells now offered prayers of thanksgiving. Chroniclers, who only months earlier had described the invaders in near-apocalyptic language, struggled to explain why the storm had passed. Some interpreted the retreat as divine intervention. Others saw it as temporary, fearing the riders would return once the thaw of spring restored mobility. What few understood was that their survival had hinged not on battlefield triumph, but on decisions made thousands of miles away. The withdrawal did not end Mongol expansion elsewhere. In the decades that followed, Mongol forces would advance into the Middle East under Hulagu Khan, culminating in the sack of Baghdad in 1258. In Asia, campaigns continued against the Song dynasty. The empire remained vast and formidable. Yet the western frontier in Europe stabilized along the edges of Hungary and the Rus territories. The immediate existential threat to Central and Western Europe receded. Diplomatic contact soon followed. In 1245, Pope Innocent IV dispatched Giovanni de Piene del Carpine as an envoy to the Mongol court. His mission was both reconnaissance and negotiation, reflecting Europe's continued uncertainty about Mongol intentions. The journey underscored a new reality: Europe was no longer confronting an unstoppable wave, but engaging a complex imperial power whose internal politics shaped its actions. The Mongols, in turn, viewed these embassies through their own lens of dominance and hierarchy. The psychological impact of the withdrawal was profound. European rulers gained time to fortify cities, reassess military organization, and observe Mongol methods more carefully. Myths began to form, reshaping the narrative from inevitable conquest to miraculous survival. Yet the truth remained less comforting. Europe had not defeated the Mongols, it had been spared by circumstance and calculation. This reprieve altered the trajectory of Western development. Political structures, trade networks, and cultural institutions continued to evolve without Mongol occupation. The decision to turn back in 1242 did not simply halt an army. It preserved a continent's path. The shock lay not only in the invasion, but in its sudden absence. The world realized that even the most unstoppable force could change direction, and that such choices could echo for centuries. In the end, the Mongols did not lose Europe, they left it. That distinction is what makes the decision so extraordinary. At the height of their momentum, after crushing armies and opening the road into the heart of the continent, they chose to turn back. The reasons were layered: the death of Ogedei, the demands of succession, rivalries within the royal family, the realities of terrain and logistics. None alone fully explains the retreat. Together, they reveal something deeper about the nature of empire. The Mongols were not an unstoppable storm without direction. They were a political system as much as a military machine. Their power depended on unity at the center. When that unity was threatened, conquest could wait. Europe's survival in 1242 was not secured by a decisive battlefield victory, but by the shifting priorities of a distant court. History often remembers the clash of armies, the thunder of hooves, the fall of cities. Yet sometimes the most consequential moments occur in silence, when a commander chooses to pivot rather than press forward. One decision, made amid winter uncertainty and imperial rivalry, altered the course of continents. The world was shocked not because the Mongols were defeated, but because they chose restraint over continuation, and in doing so, reshaped history itself.